Welcome to Timeless Talk, Wisdom, Wonder, and What's Next, where authentic voices and ageless inspiration reminds us that life doesn't slow down, it gets richer. Hi, I'm Pat Burns, and in partnership with Grand Magazine, we're bringing you candid conversations with remarkable people who keep going and growing no matter what age. And in this special Grand Magazine edition, we are featuring two very grand men who prove that living the ageless life means never slowing down your thirst for adventure. We have first Will Cockrell, author of the gripping new book, Everest Inc. He uncovers the daring world behind the booming business of Everest expeditions, a world where ambition soars higher than the peaks themselves. Joining him is Werner Berger, my good friend, a true legend in his own right, a former Grand Magazine cover star, and the oldest person to ever climb at the highest summits on all 7 continents. Together, they remind us that no matter what your age, the call to climb higher in spirit, in dreams, in life never fades. So let's jump right in, Will. And I'd like to first, I think our readers would like to know, what was the inspiration behind writing this book?
Yeah, well, it came from many years, maybe a couple decades even, of covering Mount Everest um, as a journalist, as a writer. I'm a climber and mountaineer myself, and so I sort of lived in that world a little bit, which helped me understand the athletes I was speaking to and the climbers and understand that world and terminology a bit. And really, it probably, if I were to to look back on all that, there's the running thread in the Everest narrative is how misunderstood it is, and how sort of wrong, and how many myths there are, and how wrong a lot of the storylines are, especially, and I should say that's the book is very much focused on the era of guiding. So it's in the context of the last 40 years on the mountain, since it has become a commercially guided trip on the South Col. That is the context. That's everything. That you have to understand guiding to understand every other story that comes out in the press about Everest. And so I thought helping create a new context to reset how people saw the mountain, maybe was due.
Well, it's interesting, and I'm sure Werner is going to have something to say about that too. But I'm going to continue on with another question to you, Will, first. And
Mm, yeah.
when you were researching the book, was there anything that really surprised you, or that kind of upended your assumptions about Everest, or even the guiding industry?
Um, Well, I mean, the guiding industry on Everest, I'd say the two things, one on the Western side and one on the Sherpa side. The Western side, it would be just how big a deal it was to even conceptualize the idea of guiding on Mount Everest.
Hmm.
So in hearing the stories of some of these mountaineers who were guides back home, who had guided all over the world, they were, to be a mountain guide is like it's such a career and path in its own right, like becoming a preschool teacher or something. You know what I mean? Where you're just committed to this sort of formative time in a human's life, and if you take it seriously. And a lot of these guides do take what they do very seriously, meaning they're like sort of shepherds of this transformation and this difficult thing that you do. And then they went to translate that to Everest. And I guess I had always imagined that if you're a mountain guide, you understand your business, your trade, why not just guide on Everest, right? It was like that simple. And it just turns out that the story behind trying to make that decision, whether it was ethically a good idea, whether it could be done safely, how the world would see it, how the climbing world would see it, those years of coming to that conclusion and trying some of those early guided expeditions, it's pretty fascinating. Those stories were incredible. It just made you realize like how layered it was to try to get there in the first place. And then the second one on the Sherpa front was just how much control in a good sense, how much ownership they have of the mountain and the guiding industry there now.
Sure. Yeah.
So everything has sort of gone in that direction. But I think a very popular storyline in Everest guiding these days is still the exploitation of Sherpas. It's still, for some reason, people cannot stop themselves from doing stories about, how the Westerners have this colonial attitude toward this mountain and that the Sherpas are getting the short end of the stick. And it's actually not, it's just so not the case, right? The Sherpas really run that mountain, and they're the ones profiting the most from it. And many of them are becoming extremely wealthy from it. And the Khumbu Valley is just thriving because of it. And the Westerners really have to work hard to even deserve, or not deserve, that's the wrong word, to even earn their spot on the Khumbu Glacier, to do business on the Khumbu Glacier. It's not easy to do for a Westerner these days.
Yeah, I know your book had a lot of interviews with Sherpas and guides, and
Mm.
how did you get them to open up? I mean, what there had to be some trust that you built, and how did you get to where they would really be so forthwith with you?
Yeah, that was actually a little tricky, because in the beginning, of course, you start it, the first few people haven't heard anything about what you're doing.
Mhm.
Further down the road, a year into reporting, of course, enough people have had interviews that they talk to each other, and then there's more people that are willing to talk to you. Um, it's probably all down to the questions I ask,
I see.
right? I think with reporters, a lot of times, the subject, the ones who are savvy, they can smell from a mile away what the direction of the story is by the questions you ask. And sometimes, you come out of the gate, and I think these journalists say things like, so did you ever struggle morally with the idea of guiding on Everest? And that question right off the bat is really like sort of, I don't want to say antagonistic, but it's like, for a mountain guide who feels so strongly that what they do is actually a what's a
Calling.
good word? Yeah, a calling, and also a gift of some sort to other people, right? You know what I mean? It's none of them are
Okay.
rich, you know. And then so the first question is sort of like, did you feel morally against it? Or whenever they get tagged with the idea of being greedy, it's a little laughable because they lived in the back of their pickup for the first half of their lives, you know what I mean? Like, to guide people on mountains, as climbers, a lot of climbers do. And I think really the conversations I had, and the reason why I had those questions is because I myself was genuinely curious, with an empathetic sense of where the seed of the idea of guiding on Everest began and where it went. I had a hunch in me after reporting for so many years that it just wasn't what people thought. And so I think they could see that from the first question I asked, or the second and the third. And then so they realize they're being asked different questions, and then, you go from there.
So many climbers now attempt Everest with just minimal experience, relying heavily on the guides. And this is the final question, then I'm going to move into Werner a little bit. Where do you personally draw the line between an adventurous spirit and reckless ambition?
Um, reckless ambition, an unpopular answer here, but reckless ambition has almost everything to do with attitude. So the truth is that when they say anyone can climb Mount Everest these days, this is true. The guiding infrastructure has been built around the idea that once you've been taught how to put your crampons on, how to keep yourself warm, how to take care of yourself, how to eat when food is put in front of you, these are really basic things. You know what I mean? It's like, once you've dialed in how to take care of yourself on that mountain, if you're with an amazing mountain guide, you'll summit Mount Everest.
Mhm.
I mean, that's what will happen unless you don't have the altitude genetics or whatever it is that's going to stop you, especially if you have enough of an oxygen flow, right? So it's not skill, because people show up with hardly any experience, even none. Like, I mean, like literally, they might be a triathlete that just wants to add Everest as an experience to their life. So they just intentionally gain enough experience to climb Mount Everest. This is totally antithetic to mountaineering, because the idea of mountaineering is you accumulate as much experience as you can in your life to be totally self-sufficient. You don't go into it accumulating the least amount, knowing other people will take care of you. But on Everest, it's just a different inverse attitude because the goal is not a mountaineering goal anymore. And it happens on a mountain, but it's not a mountaineering achievement so much as it was 5, 10, 20, 30 years ago. And and so really the only reckless thing to do is to show up to Mount Everest with a bad attitude, something that could endanger the people you're with, the people who paid to climb it, the Sherpas who are, supporting you, perhaps the Western guides that are supporting you. This is the great folly is, I mean, as I say, I don't know if you're allowed to use what kind of language you're allowed to use, but it's like basically I say that the worst thing you could do on Everest is show up an asshole. You know what I mean?
Mm.
Because it really is the heart of every uh sort of troubling story on Everest is almost always rooted in a self-centeredness or a narcissism or a thinking too much of yourself or too much of your skills, perhaps lying about your skills. That's really where a lot of the root of the problems on Everest are. They're not really in someone making a technical mistake. That happens very rarely on that mountain. It's almost always judgment and being a good expedition member.
Mm.
Yeah. So it's not so much skill as it is, here and here.
Sure. Makes sense. Well, that's
Yeah.
really, really some great insights there. Thank you, Will. And so,
Yeah.
Werner, I'm going to jump into you a little bit here. When you climbed Everest, what were your impressions of the commercial guiding scene at the time? And how did it help or hinder climbers like yourself?
Well, it didn't hinder me in any way, shape, or form. It's actually supported me because to be a route finder without guides, without people having gone before and putting ropes up, a very, very small fraction of people would actually succeed on Everest. And even now, a lot do not succeed. And this is one thing I would add to your comment, Will, and that is fitness level.
Yes.
Unless you're super fit, you are not going to make it. And I know some people that I climbed with in the Antarctic on Vincent Massif who came to Everest and didn't make it. And actually, one of them, when he came off, said, "Oh, this mountain is too much for me." And on my first day through the icefall, I really was. Uh, there's always a time on a mountain that somebody is just done for. I had not had that experience on the other 6 or 7. Actually, I hadn't done the 7th. I hadn't done Carson's Pyramid. Um, so I was surprised how worn out I was. And his comments, "This mountain is too much for me," kept ringing in my ears and kept ringing in my ears. And it really took some personal motivation and just the wording. It's just one step at a time. It's just one step at a time. And then the next morning, we we got to high camp, not high camp, camp 1. And the next morning, I was fine. And fitness had returned, or physical capability had returned. And the rest of the mountain literally was fun. Now, no question that the guidings absolutely helped because I'm not preparing food. I'm not carting food. I do not have to arrange for food and for tents and everything else to be in place. So it has become much easier. And as Will said, it takes attitude and it takes fitness. And the question becomes, why are you climbing this? Are you climbing this for the joy? Or is it just for the accomplishment? Big difference.
What was yours?
Oh, totally for the joy.
Okay.
Because I had got so locked into climbing. Actually, I found myself through my climbing. And I started climbing at 50, 54, 55
Oh,
was my
wow.
first mountain, my first serious mountain. And I had not really understood what presence means. I had not understood what it means to be just completely linked to everything and connected to everything. But on the mountains of the world, I experienced that. And that's a feeling that'll never go away.
Wow.
Now, it doesn't mean I don't sometimes revert from being in the present to being a bit of an ignorant somebody. But I can catch myself fairly quickly these days and say, that's just my internal conversation that's triggering this. Because look at what we've got around us.
Beautiful. I would like to remind our readers and our listeners to this interview that your ages. What age were you when you achieved the world record, Guinness Book of World Records of summiting the 7 summits on all the 7 continents? Talk a little bit about the age, and if you want to pull in how if any relationships you built with the guides, and give us a little bit of that story.
I was 77 when I did Karsten's Pyramid, which is in Papua New Guinea and replaces this tiny little mountain in Australia. This huge continent has a 7,200-foot mountain, which is a molehill in a climber's lexicon. And you literally got a path all the way up with metal grates going there. In terms of the Sherpas, they are just the most generous, the most wonderful people that you can imagine. They will literally do anything for you if you don't cross them. If you cross them, that's it. But they are there to make your trip a joy, not necessarily a summit, preferably a summit as well, but not necessarily, but to make it a joy and to make it safe.
Yeah.
It's just
a big
amazing what
responsibility.
they will do.
So last question for you, Werner, and then we're going to go to hear from both of you. Based on your own experience, what advice would you give someone dreaming of climbing Everest today, especially those considering a guided expedition?
I would say it's almost impossible to not go guided today. Very, very few people would accomplish that or go solo. There are a few. My advice to them would be go to Mount Rainier, for example, where you would learn how to use crampons and how you would learn to use carabiners and ropes and just really get a sense of how do you adapt to this environment because it is so different from the norm. Make sure that you are really, really fit and just check in with yourself. Why are you doing this? Are you trying to prove something? And quite frankly, I was needing to prove something because for the longest time, I didn't know who I was. Even at 54, when I did my first trip into the mountains, I really didn't know who this guy was. I'd run a business. I'd grown at 700% in 7 years. 7 years? Yeah, 7 years. And had retired and had become a corporate consultant, but I still did not know who this guy was. So I would just say to them, be open to whatever comes. Keep your focus on what you want, but don't sacrifice your own health for that. Now, those are just words in people's minds. They will not remember that. Because when you're in that environment and you are driven to succeed, you will do anything, even sacrifice your life. And we know a lot of people who have done that. And the comment to them would be, turn around. Because it took me 3 times to get to the top of Mount McKinley, which is now called Denali. Partly every time because of the weather, but it was smart to turn around and not to push through. Because, and the joy of it was, I could always say to myself, oh, I get another chance. That's really true. And then the third time, well, people say, oh, well, third time lucky. And I say, no, third time still bloody hard work.
Yeah.
But you're carrying all of your own equipment. You don't have Sherpas. You might have guides. But you lay the ropes, you put the ropes in, you set the tents up, you haul the food. Very different mountain.
Ooh. So guys, for both of you, some people call Mount Everest a bucket list or a deep calling. Um, some say it's more of a luxury item than a sacred goal. Will, is that a fair take? And then Werner, I want to ask if you feel that the soul of the mountain has changed. So, Will, is it a fair take that it's a bucket list or a deep calling? What do you think?
I actually think it can be both these days. I think given the nature of what it takes to climb it, you can come in and climb the mountain in any style. I guess that's a word used by climbers a lot. In what style did you climb the mountain? Fully guided, partially guided? And I was actually really curious hearing Werner talk like what his setup was, because a lot of times someone comes in with a ton of experience. They're very self-sufficient. And as I think Werner points out, it even with a ton of experience, it's almost you're working against yourself if you don't slot yourself into a guided expedition purely for the logistics. And so sometimes incredibly experienced climbers will actually climb the mountain without a guide, but with support, like some Sherpa support, they're cooking meals, etc. And so there's like every from here to here, you have um, completely looked after in every respect. And then you have on the other end, you do have some very experienced climbers that are slotting into expeditions. And I think because of that, you can show up to the mountain because it's a bucket list thing if you want, or because it's a calling or whatever. But I will add that it's not easy. There is no easy way to climb Mount Everest. It's an insanely, this is, by the way, I haven't climbed it. This is from hearing from people. You have to dig so deep to do this thing. And it is so difficult. And that narrative that Mount Everest has become easy to climb is almost a little laughable, because I don't think there's, unless you are Kami Rita Sherpa, who's climbed it 30 times or whatever, it's not easy in any version of that spectrum that I mentioned. And so some people do show up looking to climb it the same way they might be looking to finish a triathlon or an Ironman triathlon. Maybe that is a bucket list thing. But probably the thing that resonated most with what Werner said, and it's amazing to think how many guides said this exact same thing to me. It's all about knowing why you're there. The more you know why you're there and what you're hoping to get from it. And this doesn't matter what style you climb it, by the way. My book is very specific about you get to choose how supported you are, because if you know why you're there, that's the point. It doesn't matter how much support you have or don't. You know why you're there. And that goes back to the people who have less of an understanding of why they're there are usually the people that are more liabilities on the mountain. They're the ones that tend to disrupt the harmony and the safety of a group. And so I think knowing why you're there that really resonated with me.
So, Werner, do you feel the soul of the mountain has changed?
Oh, definitely to some extent. And where I think the error comes in to a large extent is the helpfulness of the Sherpas, because there are times when somebody needs to or should be turning around. But because money is an issue or tips are an issue, a Sherpa, first of all, will want you to accomplish what you set out to do. But I think there's also a monetary reason for them to support you to the nth degree. And in 96, we have some examples of that, where one of the climbers really was short roped up the summit ridge. And again, that should not be happening. People should be doing it under their own steam. And yes, there are lots of things like the ropes or the anchors that they did not place that they can use, but they need to do it under their own steam. They don't need to have somebody pull them up.
Yeah, yeah. That would be me, but okay.
Well,
No,
it wouldn't be you
believe me,
if you were fit enough.
yeah, no way, no way.
And as Will said, everybody could climb it
Yeah.
if they really wanted to, and if they fit enough, if they were prepared enough. Now that's absolutely accurate, especially if they can acclimatize. And there's we have so much knowledge about acclimatization that that's no longer a tricky thing for at least 98% of the people.
Mhm.
Will, were
The
you going to
thing,
say
yeah,
something? Yeah.
yeah. I just wanted to say that the other piece that Werner brought up that I didn't touch on, which is totally true, is this fitness level, the preparation, right? So, um, I do try hard to throw that into the category in my book, for example, of being um, in the right headspace. That coming to the mountain without that narcissism that I don't need to train as much or I don't need to put as much effort. The thing is it's true. It's like the the amount of fitness that you need to come to that mountain with, whether it's putting in miles and miles at altitude with a heavy pack or whatever, you, if you take for granted or miss that piece of the preparation, to me that falls into the category of that person who's not giving the mountain quite the respect it needs. And so
Mhm.
Werner's absolutely right that that's a piece of being a good guided climber when you show up. One interesting thing too is, and we can talk more about it if we want, but maybe it's a little of a tangent, but like I want to differentiate what happened in 96 with something that Werner was talking about there being a motivation perhaps by the Sherpas and other guides to sort of make decisions up top for clients that are ailing or not doing well. My personal opinion in 1996, just of everything I have learned and understand about Rob Hall, the Kiwi guide that died with his client who was struggling, is that I wouldn't say that that was a monetary thing. I think that it could be argued that that it was a recognition thing. I think that Rob's sense of what he wanted to be known for, and his reputation, like everyone knows he was pretty into that, and so I could see him wanting that glory, but I could also even more so sense from everybody I talked to that Rob Hall was driven by that weird thing that guides are driven by, which was to help this person achieve their dream, and was just completely turned around in his priorities, meaning do I die with my client or do I have just one death and I go down back to my family? And there's so many guides that will tell you, yeah, that idea of dying with your client crosses your mind. It's a very strange,
Wow.
yeah, it's a very strange piece. And even Dick Bass, who I'm sure Werner knows all about, that first guided, client, so to speak. When David Brashears, who was not a guide but did take responsibility for Dick, said the same thing. When they got to the top and Dick was in trouble, David Brashears said, "Boy, I think I'm probably going to die with Dick up here." Not because David was doing fine. It's because Dick wasn't doing well, and that's the attitude he took. But fast forward, and I apologize for taking up too much time on this, but it's just such an important distinction in the book. I think fast forward to today, and I think that the Nepali owned companies are having a hard time with this management up high. So this idea of telling clients who don't quite have it in them to turn around is an issue. And I think that the Sherpa owned companies should be and are being held accountable for this. There's too much irresponsibility up high in telling clients to turn around or recognizing when they're not up to the task, maybe taking them higher when they're not quite ready for it. And again, giving the benefit of the doubt, I'd like to call this growing pains in their nascent industry, like, because they haven't owned this industry for very long. And from what I can tell, they're making changes and they're working toward changing things. However, at the moment, there are, I think it's fair to say, too many preventable deaths each year. That's the key. There's always going to be unpreventable deaths, but there's a handful of preventable deaths. And I think mountain guides are trying to get that number down to zero.
Well, gave me a nice segue when you talked about somebody trying to decide, are they going to go back to their family? Are they going to die on the mountain? And that's really for both of you, but when you were researching and writing Everest, how did your family support you through such an intense and immersive process? You said it's your first book, so I'm kind of curious about that support.
Yeah, I mean, I work from home, and so I don't know how I did this, but I weirdly became just used to hearing my kids fight and play, behind my office door, and I just that became the background noise for my work, and it's great. My kids are young, and that's part of being a writer and working from home. Um, but other than that, it's the trying to work around the whims of a writer is the challenge, I think, for a family, because there's times when for 3 days I feel like I have nothing to do because I just don't have the words pouring out quite yet. And so I go work in the yard for 3 days or something. And then all of it, and I'm there as a father, there as a husband, and I'm available. And then all of a sudden I have 3 days of hold on a minute, don't bug me. And that just kind of comes and goes. And I think that's what a writer's family deals with is, all right,
Yeah.
it's time to leave them alone for 3 days.
So, what do you think your kids will take away from you writing this book and watching you go through the experience? Are they too young to even
No, they
conceptualize that?
understand it. I mean it's they're pretty, so they're 9 and 7 now. So they would have been like they would have been like 4, 5, and 6, around the beginning of the process. And they use the words like talking about what I do. They say I make books. So I think, right. So
So sweet.
they're not even quite clear on the fact that there's a factory that makes the books and this and who does what. But uh I'm not really sure. I'm waiting because I'm 52, right? So I'm a slightly older father to that age. But it's interesting because the books are something that we're waiting to it's TBD where books will fit into my children's lives, right? We
Yeah.
already know where magazines fit in. They don't, right? I mean, I'm not saying they don't, but you know what I mean? As a magazine editor and writer for years, I've watched that medium shrink.
Change. Yeah.
Um, yeah,
And,
and
and shrink.
change.
Yeah.
Yeah, change and all these things. And so I actually don't know what books will mean to my kids.
Yeah.
I'm assuming, I just don't know. And so if books remain an important thing in our culture, I think they'll slowly understand what their dad did. You know what I mean? In a more meaningful
Yeah.
way. But
Yeah.
if books don't, right, then I don't know.
Well, you can always say you're a published author, though.
I know, exactly.
So, Werner, you've climbed some of the most dangerous peaks. How did your family feel about you continuing such a ambitious goal later in your life?
I was really lucky. Everybody cheered for me. And Hashi, her comment has always been, if I'm not afraid, she's not afraid.
Mm.
And that she was really just involved in the last 3 mountains actually that I did. And my sons, actually, one of my sons got me into mountaineering because he said to me, "You've always said you wanted to climb Mount Everest. Why don't we trek to Everest Base Camp?" 2 years later, we did that, and that was my capture. I do want to add one thing about you, Will, and I want to plus something you said.
Yeah,
You asked what allowed you to connect with the Sherpas. You said my questions, and
yeah,
my immediately I thought, no, your questions are just a symptom of who you were being. And then a little bit later on, you talked about empathy and connection. And that is really what makes a difference in human existence. Who are you being when you're saying or you asking or you're interacting with me? That goes well beyond what your
yeah,
beautiful words might be.
mm,
And
yeah,
that stands out to me the minute I hear you talk.
yeah. I
Passion is
think
there. You're
and it was
congruent,
real, right? That's the main thing is I
real and
wasn't a
congruent.
I wasn't a journalist trying to sort of convey empathy. I actually was so curious
Yeah.
about this world from their perspective.
Mhm. And
Well,
empathy is
guys,
something you don't fake.
well,
Yeah,
thank you so much. I know that this is something that I think our readers will really thoroughly enjoy. And just in closing, I wanted to say through Will Cockrell's deep dive into the business of big mountains and Werner Berger's record breaking journey to the top of the world, We're reminded that adventure isn't bound by age. It's fueled by purpose, grit, and willingness to keep climbing. So thank you, Will and Werner, for such an interesting conversation full of wisdom and wonder. And thanks for everyone for joining us on Timeless Talk, Wisdom, Wonder, and What's Next. Until next time, keep growing, keep wondering, and keep living the ageless life.